Is it possible to do the ABCs of chess? Why, yes. Yes, it is. And today, we're going to do just that. That's right. You're going to become a smarter chess player while going through chess terms all the way from A to Z. Now, a couple of these letters, there's several terms, and a couple of them, I really struggled. Do you think we can get through all 26 letters? Well, we're going to find out. Let's start with A. A is for attack, because in kids' chess, whoever is the attacker is almost always going to do better. In this starting position, white is actually down. Black has 2 rooks. White only has 1 rook, but white is the attacker. Black's king is stuck in the center, and white won this fantastic game by first capturing the rook. And then, when the knight took back, white decided to give away the queen. What an attacking move that is. And the knight had to capture because the king was in check. But when the knight captured, the rook moved all the way up to d8. And that's a checkmate. The king cannot capture because if he tries to, the bishop would get the king. So, in chess, better to be the attacker than defender in most cases. What about the letter B? Well, B is for back rank. That is the rank leading to your own king. A rank is a side-to-side row. So white has a back rank of number 1, and black's back rank is always number 8, and a lot of checkmates happen on the back rank. In fact, in my first state championship, I lost 2 games, both because I didn't know about back rank mate. Here's what it looks like. Let's pretend that white is super tricky and does not worry about his pawn and plays the move rook c1. And black says, la da 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 da, wait, I can take off free pawn, rook takes pawn. Oh no! But black forgot about the back rank. This rook travels all the way up the board to c8, and the black king is checkmated because the rook invades from the side, that's black's back rank, and the king can't move off the back rank because those pawns that were meant to protect him are actually getting in the way. We're going to figure out how to stop back rank mate a little bit later in our ABCs of chess. But we move on to C, maybe the most important word in all of chess, checkmate. Checkmate is how you win a game. It's when you check the king, put him in danger, and he can't get out. He can't move, he can't block, he can't capture. This is an actual game of mine. I'm already threatening checkmate on the 7th move of the game. If my queen takes this pawn, the king would definitely be in danger, and the king would not be able to capture the queen because the bishop is there for backup. So, in the game, my opponent decided to stop the checkmate by playing d6, but then I found something called checkmate in 2. My queen first captured the pawn. The king is in check. He can't run away because the queen would still get him. So the king moved to d7. And can you find the checkmate? Well, we actually don't use the queen, because if the queen moves here, the king would just step back. So let's go back and figure out what can we use instead? Well, it's the bishop. Bishop to e6, and I gave checkmate on the 8th move of the game. I was a pretty happy boy when I got to do that. The letter D. We could use it for several things in chess, but let's go with discovered attack. Now, what does that mean? Well, you've used the word discovered before. When someone knocks on your door, you don't know who it is, but you open the door to discover that it's your neighbor who baked you a pie. Hey, that sounds kind of great. Your neighbor is not moving anywhere. Your neighbor is waiting for the door to open up. And that's what we see here. This is the most popular discovered attack in chess. The queen is aiming at the knight. And when the knight runs away, we need to open the door because right now, this is our neighbor with the pie, and this is you. Well, actually, you're not getting a pie, you're getting a nasty surprise. But the point is, the knight is the door. Once the knight moves, we will discover that the queen is aiming at the king. And here's the trick with discovered attack. That piece that you're moving out of the way to open up the line, you need to do something really awesome with that piece. And that piece is usually able to move wherever it wants without fear of being captured. There's a couple of exceptions, but let me show you what I mean. The strongest move in this position is to actually move your knight to c6. Now, under any other circumstance, that would be completely nutty because there's 2 pawns and a knight that could all capture, but actually black can't capture. Because when you play knight c6, it is check. And the rules of chess say that you have to focus on your king's safety first. So, no matter what black does to get the king out of check, the knight will capture the queen, and white will be very happy that the discovered check was played. Note that even if the queen blocks the check, we can still take the queen with the knight, and white is very happy. Don't forget about discovered attack. E is for endgame, and endgames are a part of chess that you just have to study. They're quite fun, and in fact, if you are good at calculating, you will be great at endgames. Unfortunately, a lot of endgames you need to learn. They're not obvious. Nobody is born just knowing their endgames. So for example, in this endgame with the white pawn traveling up the board, white is winning, but there's only one winning move, and it's not pawn d5, and it's not king e5. You can actually only win the game by playing the move king to d5, and white has gained something called the opposition. We don't have time to talk about how to win this endgame, but I wanted to reserve the letter E for endgame because that's how I won a lot of games when I was a kid, and you need to study them. F is for Fun Master. No, just kidding. That's me, but I'm not the most important F. Let's go with fianchetto. That's right, there's actually a lot of words that come from other languages, and we're going to do a couple of them today. This one is Italian, and you might even sound more Italian if you say fianchetto. Now, fianchetto means little flank. So the bishop usually travels this way in a chess game. Oh, probably not all the way to a6 though. That would be dangerous. So a very common starting move is to move the pawn forward so the bishop can move to a square like c4. However, sometimes in chess, we bring our bishop out to the little flank or the little diagonal, and there's a reason why. So for example, white could begin the game with g3, and the idea is to move the bishop to this little diagonal and have that bishop aim at the center of the board. In fact, let me show you what this might look like. Let's pretend black plays d5. Now we fianchetto our bishop, and our bishop is already aiming at this pawn. And if black plays e5, we can start targeting this pawn. That's the usual idea of the fianchetto bishop. White could play c4, and if black defends the pawn, white can play knight c3. And you see the point. White keeps aiming at all of those light squares. That's the dynamic of the fianchettoed bishop. G is for the highest title in chess, which is Grandmaster. And I am not a Grandmaster. It is really rare to become one. You usually have to study 8 hours a day and make that your focus. In fact, there are fewer than 2,000 Grandmasters in the entire world. That is a super small amount. There's way more doctors and lawyers. Grandmaster is a really hard title to get. Do you know any Grandmasters? Well, let's put one up on the screen. Mr. Magnus Carlsen, the highest rated Grandmaster of all time. He actually became a Grandmaster when he was still a teenager. Pretty amazing stuff. I hope you go on to become a Grandmaster or at least get to your highest title in chess. H is for helper mate. Helper mate is when the queen does almost all of the work, but she needs some help. Just like sometimes your mom, she's doing a lot for your family, but she needs some help from your dad. And let's take a look at how that might look like in a chess game. Here, white can win the game using the helper checkmate, and white should start out by making the queen travel closer to the black king. And we're going to have that queen keep on following this king. She's following this king all the way to the corner. But when the king gets to the corner, she can't checkmate by herself. If she travels to the square d8 to give check, then the king will run away. And instead, if she travels to a square like a7, oh no, she has no helper. The king will capture the queen. So what we need to do in this position is to advance our own king. Here comes the helper. And the white king continues advancing up the board. Now it's time for a helper checkmate. Queen to b7 is one of the checkmates that white has. And the whole point is that the queen does almost all the work. She checks the king. She aims at that square. 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 She's doing all this work, but the king makes sure that the queen cannot be captured. If the black king tries to capture, well, you know, in chess, two kings can't touch. They have stinky breath. Ew. If the king tries to capture, the computer will not let me. Error, error, Fun Master Mike. And that's all because our own king is keeping our queen safe. That is the classic helper checkmate. Well, I've got a little trick in store for you. We're going to do a couple of I terms all in one position. The first I term is isolated pawn. Now, isolated pawn sounds a little bit like island, and you are not wrong if you figured out the connection in those words. This pawn right here is an isolated pawn. What that means is there are no other white pawns that can defend the d4 pawn. There's no pawn on the c file, there's no pawn on the e file. So isolated pawns are often quite weak. However, let me show you a little bit of an exception here. If black wants to try to win this pawn, of course black better not take on the first move because black will lose the queen. So black might play a move like knight c6 to double attack this pawn. There are 2 attackers and there's only 1 defender. So far, so good for black. Now white will defend with knight f3. 2 attackers and 2 defenders, the pawn is safe. Now black could play the move bishop to g4. Uh-oh. This bishop's about to destroy one of the defenders of the isolated pawn. But now white plays bishop to e2 with a trick. When black takes the knight, white takes back with the bishop, and black thinks that he has won this pawn because there are 2 attackers and there's still only that 1 defender. So black plays queen takes. But now we get to our other I term, which is called intermezzo. And if you're tired of speaking Italian, that's okay. You can call it in-between move because that still begins with an I. Here's the point of in-between move. White wants to capture the queen, but does not want to lose his queen back. So white plays an in-between move first. White takes the time out to first capture the knight, which is check. Ooh, by playing that in-between capturing the queen, now white will win the queen for free. Because when black takes back, nothing is guarding the queen, so queen takes queen and white should win this game. Isolated pawn, intermezzo, in-between move, they're all great I words. Now, we go to J. It is hard to figure out a word in chess that begins with J that I want you to know. So, we're gonna have to switch languages again. J'adoube. That's right. We've got some French speakers in the house now. Je in French means I, and j'adoube roughly means I'm adjusting a piece. Now in online chess, this doesn't make much sense because the computer automatically puts pieces right in the middle of the squares. But in over-the-board chess, you know, sometimes we accidentally knock over pieces, or sometimes we accidentally put them where they're touching 2 squares. So for example, I'm going to pick up this pawn, and I'm going to hover this pawn on this square. Can you tell which square it's on? Well, kind of. But sometimes in chess, you simply want to clarify to tell your opponent which square a piece is on, but you don't want to have to move that piece. So the polite thing to do in chess is to say the word j'adoube, which is I adjust, before putting that piece back in the middle of the square. If you don't say j'adoube, you might be forced to move the piece if you're playing in a tournament. And in this position, white does not want to move this pawn, because if white moves the pawn forward, white has just opened the door to his own bishop. White loses the bishop and is going to lose the rook. However, if white instead says j'adoube and then puts the pawn back in the middle of the square, white is not required to move it. Again, in online chess, none of these things are important because your opponent can't hear you and your pieces are always in the middle of the squares. But whenever you transition to over-the-board chess IRL, you're going to want to say this word j'adoube. Of course, if you want to just say I adjust, that's perfectly fine as well. Let's move on to K. And for K, we've got to talk about the big boss man, somebody that is often regarded as the best chess player of all time. That would be Kasparov. Garry Kasparov. If you want to say Kasparov, that's great too. He was world champion for most of my childhood, and he is often regarded to be the strongest chess player of all time. Some people say it's some other players, but my money is on Kasparov, and I need you to know his name because he is the Michael Jordan of chess. We move on to L, and you're thinking, Fun Master Mike, I've already seen this position. That's right, you have. However, let's talk about how black could have gotten out of the back rank mate. Remember earlier, I showed you that if this rook takes the pawn, then black would be back rank checkmated because he left his own king in danger, and these pawns are preventing the black king from moving forward. So if we go back to this position, a smarter move for black would be to move one of these pawns, and in this position, it doesn't really matter which one. Let's pick the H pawn. Now black has created a little bit of air for his king, and Luft or Luft is the German word for air. For whatever reason, we like using these foreign words in chess, but you're going to want to know the idea even more than the word. If you're afraid of back rank mate, only at the end of the game, give your king a little bit of Luft. Now, if white plays a move like b4, you can happily capture the pawn, because when the rook gives check, no big deal. You have Luft, you have air, the king steps out of the check, and now black actually has an extra pawn. Which brings us to the letter M, which is for material. And material is like the score of the game. You're always going to want to know who is ahead in material. Now, this position should also look familiar to you because we used it at the very beginning of our video today. If you want to know who is ahead in chess, well, hopefully you know the point values of the pieces. Pawns are worth 1, bishops and knights are both worth 3, rooks are worth 5, queens are worth 9, and we don't put a value on the king because you can't actually capture a king. Now remember, unlike a basketball game, material, or the score, doesn't actually decide the game, it just usually tells you who is better. And the quickest way to count material is just to see what one side has compared to the other side. No grandmaster would actually add up all the points for white, and then all the points for black, and then do a big subtraction. That would take too long. So here's how to figure out the material. Let's start with the big pieces. The queen. Who has more queens? No one. It's 1-to-1. So mentally, we can just forget they exist because it's the same on both sides. Now let's count the rooks. We have a big difference. Black has 2 rooks, white only has 1. So we have to remember that black is ahead of rook. Now let's count bishops and knights together because they're both worth 3 points. White has 2 and black has 2. By the way, bishops and knights together are called minor pieces. Hey, that's another M word. Pretty cool how that works out. Now lastly, we're going to count pawns. White has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. By the way, kids often make small mistakes on the pawns because there's so many of them, so make sure you count those pawns carefully. So white seems to have 2 extra pawns, but black has an extra rook. And without doing any big math puzzles, we now know that black is ahead. A rook for 2 pawns. And since 2 pawns is worth 2 points, and a rook is worth 5, you could just say that black is ahead 3 points, because 5 minus 2 is 3. However, if you just know that it's rook for 2 pawns, that's good enough. But also remember that material, or points, do not decide chess games. I already talked about the fact that white is going to win this game by giving away lots of material. In fact, white gave away a queen, if you'll remember back to the beginning of the video, and after knight takes, rook to d8 is checkmate. Now white has a lot less material in the final position, but checkmate is still checkmate. So keep an eye on your material, but remember that checkmate is still the goal of chess. And now Cookie Monster wants to do the second half of the alphabet. Okay, I'm going to go back to Fun Master Mike voice. I think we'll all be better off that way. What is N for? Well, N is for notation, which is a fancy word for how you write down your moves. Now, when you play on ChessKid, your notation will be done for you, but let's give a brief little lesson. For example, let's pretend here that this bishop moves to this square. If you were to write down your own moves in real life, you would write down a capital B for bishop, and then a lowercase c4, because the bishop is landing on c4. If you were to move your knight, this is the one time in chess where we pretend that you're not a good speller, even though we know you really are. Let's pretend you move your knight to c3. We actually use the letter N for knight, even though you superstar spellers out there know that knight actually begins with a silent K. But we reserve the K for king, so this is literally the one time in your life where your teacher is telling you you can misspell a word. Here we would write down capital N for knight, and then C3. Just a little bit about notation. The letter O. Well, this is all about open file, a very important concept in chess. Files are all of the up and down rows of the chessboard. However, if there's a file with no pawns on it, we call that an open file, and it's basically an invitation for your rooks to land there, because rooks hate pawns. Look at this rook. This rook is getting mad at his own pawn. Hey, Mr. Pawn, why are you there? But not to worry. Even though the pawn on f2 cannot magically disappear, the rook can get glory on his own by playing rook to d1, and this rook completely controls the open file. Now, sometimes the rook moves all the way down to go for that back rank mate we talked about before. That, of course, will not happen because this rook is waiting for him. However, on the next turn, I think this rook is going to stop on d7 and start capturing a whole bunch of black pawns, just like Pac-Man. Just one of the many uses of the open file. For the letter P, I'm going to give myself doubled points because we have a double P word. We're going to go with passed pawn. I could have gone with pin, but passed pawn, it just sounds so good. A passed pawn is a pawn that has no other pawns stopping it from becoming a queen on the other side of the chessboard. This is most common in the endgame. And in this position, you can see none of white pawns are passed because there are black pawns either in the way or able to capture them as they advance. But in this very famous tactic, white can actually give away 2 pawns to create 1 passed pawn, which, as you know, when it gets to the other side, will turn into a queen. And the trick here is to push the center pawn, and it doesn't matter which way black takes you. Let's say that black captures this way. Now, the tricky move. We actually don't capture back, because if we do capture back, black could actually push, and now our pawns are going nowhere. The tricky move here is pawn to a6, and our pawn is about to capture, become a passed pawn. So black virtually has to capture, and now this pawn advances, and look at that, just like magic. This pawn is a passed pawn. There are officially no black pawns stopping Mr. C pawn from becoming a queen, and in 2 moves, white will get the first queen. Now, technically you might be thinking, hey, Fun Master, aren't both of these pawns passed? That is true, but white's pawn is so much faster that white's new queen will come back and collect all of the black pawns. Let's move on to Q. Now, Q might seem like a hard letter, but luckily in chess, we have a queen which begins with Q. But you know what? We could also go with queen side. That is anything on the left side of the board, and we use this term a lot. The queenside pawns, or the queen's knight. In this position, if white decides to castle this way, which he's allowed to do, we could call that castling queenside. We even have one more usage of this Q word. When a pawn gets to the other side, the technical term is promotion, but since 99% of the time you want a queen, often in chess we just call it queening a pawn. So all things to do with the queen, we had to go with that for the letter Q. R is rating. Ooh, this is a word that the kids love to talk about. This is a 3 or 4 number word that goes by your name. Whether you're playing on ChessKid or in real life, you will get a chess rating. Number one thing I want to explain, it's not something to stress about. It goes up sometimes, it goes down sometimes, depending on who you beat, who you lose to, who you make a draw against, and what their rating is. I will tell you this, your rating will go up over time if you play enough chess and if you watch a lot of videos and if you learn. It may not go up in the short term, but I promise it will go up over time. What are some examples of ratings? Well, most kids start out at 200 or 300 or 400. If you get yourself above 1,000, you're already in the top half of kids on ChessKid. If you get your rating to 2,000, you're what's called an expert. 2,200, a master. And if you get all the way to 2,500 one day, you are considered a grandmaster. You have to do 1 or 2 other things, but that is the main rating for grandmaster. The highest rating of all time was almost 2,900. And I will tell you, even the highest rated player in the world, Magnus Carlsen, he is no longer at his highest rating of all time. But did he quit chess? No. It inspired him to try to get better and get back to his top rating. So again, don't worry if your rating goes down. It's just a number and it will go up if you play enough chess. Let's move on and talk about maybe the most exciting word in chess, the sacrifice. Yeah, we had a lot of options for the letter S, but I had to go with sacrifice. In this position, black has this pawn in deep trouble. Black is having this pawn aimed at twice, but black sacrifices the pawn. Instead of trying to defend it, black plays bishop c5. Well, that's sacrifice number 1. Now let's say that white captures with the knight. You can see this knight is actually aiming at the rook. and the queen. But now, instead of saving either one, black plays sacrifice number 2. Can you guess it? Bishop takes f2, giving away the bishop for a pawn, but to draw the king out. And if the king accepts the sacrifice, now we can capture another pawn with check, which also opens the door for our queen to come out. For example, if the king tucks himself back into bed, queen to h4, saving the queen. And you better not take the rook, because if you do take the rook, we have an example of queen and helper mate, just like we learned earlier in this video. A couple of cool sacrifices by black. For the letter T, we're going to learn yet another new word from a different language. T is for tempo, and tempo is Italian or Latin for time. And in chess, when you gain or lose a move, sometimes we say you have gained a tempo. It basically means one move, one unit of time. One thing that I see some kids do in these sort of positions is they play knight to g5. But the knight's not really going to be able to win this pawn by himself. You can see this bishop is not on c4. There is no double attack. So what black should probably do is say, hey, Mr. Knight, I'm not afraid of you. I'm going to play the no parking sign, h6. And you know what? Unless white wants to lose a knight, white's best move is probably to go right back, but that represents a loss of time or tempo. One move for moving the knight to g5 and another move for moving the knight back. You could almost say that after black castles, black has gotten 2 free moves. 1 with the pawn and then 2 to get the king castle. Black has gained 2 tempos, but not Tempe. Tempe is a city in Arizona. We say tempos. Moving on to the letter U. Well, we've already mentioned queening, and remember I told you that queening happens 99% of the time when a pawn gets to the other side? Well, it's time to take a look at the other 1%. In this position, if you move your pawn to the other side and you select a queen, black has a bishop and a queen working together, the queen's gonna come to b2 and we got checkmated. However, the letter U is for under promotion. This is for one of those rare times in chess where you want something besides a queen. And often that means a knight, because the knight has special powers that the queen doesn't have. If we promote to knight, we save the day, because it's check. And like magic, when the king moves, we will be able to capture the queen and avoid the checkmate. So when the king moves, we capture the queen, and even though we lose our knight, we now have 6 pawns versus a bishop. Whose side would you rather be? I think you'd rather be white in this position. U for under promotion. Moving on to the letter V. V is for visualize. Now that's a big word, but I'm sure you know the word vision. That means seeing. And visualize is kind of like seeing into the future. This is a great skill to have in chess. For example, if you want to right now, close your eyes for a second. Don't fall asleep. Can you picture the chessboard in your brain? I bet you can. And if I announce a move like pawn to e4, which is the pawn in front of the white king moving 2 squares, can you visualize that? I bet you can. In fact, you may be able to do 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 moves. Okay, open your eyes. In chess, we often have to visualize things happening before we know whether or not they are good or bad. This is actually an example from one of my actual games that I played when I was a kid. Now this is a little bit of a tough one, but I'm going to ask you to try to visualize. In this position, I was considering moving my pawn to d4. Okay, I drew an arrow to help you out a little bit. Now here was what I was visualizing in my head. The black pawn taking the white pawn. My pawn taking the black pawn back. But then I thought the bishop would take my knight, and I would take back with my queen. And at the end of all that, can you see what black can capture? Black could play pawn takes pawn, and I actually end up losing a pawn. And I visualized all that, and I thought, oh no, I don't want to lose a pawn. So I played a different move. But if I was even better than I was when I was a kid, I would have visualized even further, and I would have seen that there was a rock star move. At the end of all that, I could actually advance my pawn to e5 and get a crushing attack. Now, that's pretty challenging. I know it is. So what I'm going to do now is move the pieces and be a little bit nice and show you what you might have visualized. White loses a pawn. Black loses a pawn. White loses a knight. But then black loses a bishop. So far, the points are equal. But then black takes a pawn. And if you were able to visualize this pawn coming forward, 3 stars for you. And in this position, I think white is much better because look at the rook lined up with the king. Look at the queen lined up with the pawn. Look at the bishop lined up on black's weak spot. I think that white is doing just fine in this position. Let's move on to perhaps the most rare tactic in chess. W is for windmill. And windmill is basically when you play a series of discovered attacks over and over against the enemy king. This is a pretty cool example. In this position, white actually sacrificed the queen just to get the windmill. Now here it comes. Black took, and the bishop took back. And this king really only has one move. The king ran away. Now it's time to get that windmill going around and around. Knight to g6 check. The king only has one move, which is to go to h7. Now white takes the rook, which is not only discovered check, but it's actually double check. So the king had to run back to h8. But remember, a windmill goes around and around. So we're going to play our knight back to g6 check, which forces the king back to h7. Now, if this knight could keep capturing things, that would be one way to make a windmill work. There's nothing else to capture, so the knight reroutes himself to a useful square. The knight goes to e5. Once again, a discovered check. The king goes back to h8, and now white plays knight to f7 checkmate. Notice that white had to take that rook a few moves ago, otherwise there'd be a rook that could save the day by taking the knight. But by white taking the rook first and creating a windmill, this spectacular checkmate was played in the game. X is for something that I hope you've never had to have, an X-ray. Yeah, an X-ray is when something goes bad and you fell off the slide or something. But in chess, an X-ray is when one piece travels through another piece to attack or defend it. Okay, here's an example. Black has a weak back rank. Remember, black never pushed any of these pawns to create luft. Now, if you simply take this rook to give check, then black will take back and nothing has been gained by white. In fact, white is in danger of getting put in back rank mate. So let's go back. In this position, we can actually sacrifice our queen. Now, it looks like she has no defenders, but actually this white rook travels through the black rook to defend the queen, and that is exactly what an X-ray does in real life, and that's what an X-ray is in the chess game. The only move for black is to capture, and now we very plainly see that this rook was actually secretly defending the queen. Rook takes rook is a checkmate. That's a great example of X-ray. Moving on, Y was a tough letter, maybe the toughest letter to come up with the chess term. So, for the first time, we're going to name an opening. This particular setup of pieces is so common in the Sicilian defense that it has a name. It's called the Yugoslav variation, or you can call it the Yugoslav attack. And Yugoslav, of course, begins with Y. It's a former country of Europe. In this position, black is saying, hey, I've got my rook lined up with your bishop and your king. I'm going to throw my pawns down the board and go for a checkmate. And white is saying, hey, I've got this pawn that's going to come up to h5. I'm going to create an open file. Remember that term? My rook is going to blast down the h file, and I'm going to create some checkmate threats against your king. Now, whose plan is better? Well, it all comes down to whose plan is faster. And in fact, grandmasters disagree on who's better here. That's what makes chess so interesting. This particular position has been played so many times for white and for black by top-level players, and it remains one of the most exciting openings, the Yugoslav attack. For Z, well, you might have thought Z was a tough one to come up with, but we go back to our different words, and this time we go to the German language, and we have a word called Zugzwang, which sounds like it begins with a T, but my German friends promise me that it begins with a Z. Zugzwang means you are forced to move, but you don't want to. Unfortunately, in chess, you can't pass. So there are some times, usually in the endgame, where you put your opponent in a position where any move that he or she makes is going to be bad and ruin the position. This is a very famous chess tactic, where white plays the amazing rook h6. Notice the rook should not take the pawn because the bishop is waiting. In this position, black is in Zugzwang. Black would like to just chill, but black's not allowed to. Black has to make a move. Now, this pawn can't capture, because if it tries to, you can see black would be putting his own king in check. So you might think, oh, well, black can just take the rook. But the point of white's move is to open this square. Now the pawn delivers checkmate by itself. and black's only other option is to move this bishop, but then that loosens the defense of the h7 pawn. So if the bishop moves anywhere at all, then rook takes pawn reaches a checkmate. So this is a very cool example of Zugzwang when you put your opponent in a position where any move is bad. Now we've done our ABCs of chess. I hope you've learned some new terms, and I hope you are a more well-studied chess player by watching our video.